Okay, that's great. Okay, welcome everybody. This is the Saturday space stream by Nexus Aurora. I'm your host Cohen from the Next Astro YouTube channel, and today we have a special guest named Kamil Muzyka from Poland talking to us about space law. Just so you know, we'll have a talk of about 45 minutes, and after that there will be a Q&A. Anyone can ask their questions in this YouTube channel, but also on all the Reddit posts that we have created for this talk. I am actually going to hand over the word to Kamil after 1 second. So Kamil is working on his PhD at the Institute of Law Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences. And besides being a science advocate, educator, he mostly works as a prior art researcher and expert on space and patent law for private government and non-government entities. I can tell you guys that we are very happy to welcome Kamil Muzyka here in our midst, and I'm really looking forward to the talk. Again, post your questions underneath the YouTube channel, and I will be asking them to Kamil after this presentation. So, with that, Kamil, take it away, and good luck with the presentation.
Thank you, and greetings everyone. My name is Kamil Muzyka, as I have been introduced, and my talk is going to be on Martian cities and civics. The full title is The Contemporary Legal Ramification of Space Settlement Activities and Possible Solutions for Future Large Population Dwellings. What I mean by that is I'm going to introduce you to the contemporary international space law with some addition to non-governmental acts and national legislations, and talk about some possibilities and conundrums and also obstacles that will be faced by future space law. So, first of all, we have, when we are talking about Mars cities, Mars space settlements, colonizing Mars, which is actually a term that we don't use in space law. And that is not, don't get me wrong, it's not because in international space law we don't want people to settle on Mars. We actually do, at least some of us do, let's be straight, but there is a problem that stems from the term colonization. You see, colonies were mostly the extensions of natural territories of a state that were outside their border, for example, on another continent. And they were quite exploitative, so because of the ramifications of the international space law that forbids appropriation and claims of sovereignty on celestial bodies, we don't use the term colonies, we use settlements. We use habitats, but, well, it's a quasi-philosophical, historical element of international space law. So, who wants to live on Mars? That's the first question we actually have to ask ourselves, because this is first thing we have to say is it won't be a penal colony. Nobody should be forced to live on Mars. They mostly will be volunteers, but another thing that we have to keep in mind is that they won't mostly be astronauts. And by saying they won't mostly be astronauts, I don't mean that they won't go into space and live via virtual projections. What I mean that most people won't get the astronaut status, especially in the case when we have, for example, dwellings with a population of 1,000, 2,000, 5,000. If you have 12 people on Mars living in small shelter habitats, they are mostly astronauts recognized by the government and bearing the astronaut title. with people amassing in thousands, having women, children, and so on, and people who are, well, not qualified to fly space equipment, they're mostly something like spaceflight participants, and they'll probably have their own legal recognition. But an astronaut is someone special, and I'll be going for it a bit later. Also, we need to recall that we are talking about cities, mostly enclosed spaces, and not a fully terraformed Mars. Is my presentation running? Oh, yeah, okay. So sorry, because I didn't see it going here. Okay, so cities on Mars are mostly enclosed spaces, which is a different set of difficulties that, for example, a fully terraformed planet or a fully livable planet doesn't have. And we have to bear that in mind. So first thing I have to reiterate that most people seem to forget a spacesuit is a space object, and it's mostly registered. So even if you go outside of your base, you're still in somebody else's jurisdiction. You're outside of Earth's jurisdiction if you take off the suit. Well, of course, talking about international space law, not talking about intergovernmental agreements. But anyway, while I'm not talking about the terraforming, there is two answers to that. First of all, the talk was going to be about Mars cities, so we shall keep to the Martian cities. Second of all, terraforming is a very complex project. And speaking about law for space law for terraforming is like asking people, so what are the criminal jurisdiction on a Dyson sphere? It's a mega project that will surely have its own authority and its own regulations that are, well, far from what we have today. Something maybe quite like a Panama Canal or even the ISS, but in any way they would have a lot of new technologies, a lot of new solutions that are far beyond what we have today and far beyond what is mostly being addressed in the legal academia. So, also another thing, we are talking about humans. There will be talk about AI and things like that, but I won't be going into my special fields of space manufacturing, the use of synthetic biology, and so on. So those will be typical humans like me, you, your neighbors, and so on, who just got to Mars and are here living, working, and so on. Not cyborgs, not post-humans, and things like that. Although I'm a transhumanist, I'm currently talking about normal humans. If you want to sell somebody space, but you're telling them that you have to go for a pantropic process of adapting a human via cybernetization or other means to live in this space, well, you're actually not selling him space, you're selling him another life as a different person. So, anyway, we need to start with the international law. The international space law, which is what we mostly say when we say space law, is the number of acts which regulate the activities of governments and their private entities in outer space and on celestial bodies. What is the outer space? It is a tricky question because there are two definitions of outer space. One is the piece of space beyond the Kármán line. I recall it was the lower troposphere. Above the atmosphere, it was like beyond 88th kilometer beyond above sea level. And there is also the idea that the functional space starts above the 120th kilometer above sea level, where a space object can actually achieve an orbit. Complete an orbit without propulsive assistance, for example. Because, well, the remnants of the atmosphere aren't so thick, so it can actually use its velocity without additional propulsion. Not counting, of course, the breathing rockets and ideas like that. And what are celestial bodies? Well, space law doesn't regulate, doesn't actually dictate what's a celestial body, and this is also a question for space law academia, but well, not for this topic, because well, we are talking mostly about Mars, which Mars is obviously a planet and a celestial body. Well, the problem with celestial bodies starts with, for example, what do you do? What do you do with, for example, cloud moons like Earth's Kordylewski moons? Are they treated as a celestial body, or are they just clouds of dust that we don't treat them as celestial bodies, and therefore they are not regulated by space law? Anyhow, we have 4 canonic treaties that have originated during the Cold War, because the main purpose of international space law was to regulate space activities in such a manner that the outer space won't become a battleground for the Eastern and the Western bloc, and most treaties were like dismissive of the they were called then third world countries, so now we call them developing nations, but, well, calling them developing nations also a bad term for nations that are struck with poverty and international debt loops. Anyhow, you have 4 canonical treaties, and the 5th treaty, which has been in a state of limbo, and it has been mostly rejected outright by the United States 2 times. First in the 1980s, when it was rejected in the Senate, via the lobby of the National Space Institute and the L5 Society, which later became the National Space Society, and also other pro-space NGOs. And very recently by the now former president Donald J. Trump, who issued an executive order where it was stated that America rejects the Moon Agreement. And also there are several additional resolutions on remote sensing, nuclear power, nuclear propulsion, but nuclear and nuclear devices in outer space. So yeah, there are many things, and yeah, remote sensing, of course, yeah. There are many things that have been covered in the international space law, but the worst thing is that, well, space debris hasn't been yet covered by international space law beyond the Liability Convention. So, the 4 main treaties are the Outer Space Treaty, which is mostly referenced in discussions on space mining, on space exploration, exploitation, on settlement, and so on jurisdiction. The Rescue Agreement, which is a very nice Sleeping Beauty, let's call it this way. An agreement which actually regulates what happens to a space object or the crew of a space object which lands on either international waters or a territory belonging to another nation. It actually is about salvage, recovery, and so on. The Liability Convention, of course, deals with liability for damage done by any space object to people on Earth, in outer space, and so on. So it will be it is included in my discussion on Mars. And the Registration Convention, which is, let's say, an attempt to create, to encourage nations to create their own space registries, and in order to create a United Nations Space Registry, which would actually enumerate objects and would classify them, so we could follow which of the space object actually is in outer space, what happened to them, was it burned up in atmosphere or brought into a graveyard orbit, and so on and so forth. And also we need to recall that registration convention is very necessary, because the basics of the international space law is that the registry is what constitutes the jurisdiction and control of a space object. But there are also problems with that, but we'll deal with that later. And also, as I said, the Moon Agreement. The Moon Agreement has only 18 signatories, some 11 ratifications, something like that. The newest ratification was, I recall, Venezuela in 2018. The Moon Agreement has been object of a international beef since its conception, because it is, besides having some wonderful ideas on space equipment, jurisdiction, the return of space equipment, or extension of jurisdiction, and so on and so forth. Or, for example, the rescuing of people on the moon who are members of another, who are, sent there by other nations. There is also the idea of space resources and terraforming. It regulates that, of course, the changes to the environment of a celestial body, but what is the biggest beef there is about the regulations, or actually the possibility of regulations regulating the governance of space resources in a way that isn't like, it's not being liked by the United States or the other developed nations who refuse to sign it. Well, because it says that if you commercially start mining, you will have to have to comply with a future regime that also establishes a model for sharing the benefits between the nations of the Earth from space mining. I did several papers on the idea of space mining. This was my first introduction to space law, actually, and the problem of what constitutes a space resource and not. Well, we will be actually talking about this in several minutes, as I see. But anyway, you have to keep in mind that currently the Moon Agreement isn't considered canon, although every time you go to the UN COPUOS and there is a discussion about space treaties, there are sides who are pro the Moon Agreement, mostly those who actually have signed or ratified it, and those who think that the Moon Agreement should go and want to go a different route, like, for example, the route presented by the Hague Space Resource Governance Work Group or the Artemis Accords. So, next up to the definitions. So I said something about celestial bodies, so we can skip that. Second thing we have to say, we have to talk about, is space objects. Space objects are manufactured objects that have been sent into outer space from Earth. Well, that's the International Space Law definition. The International Space Law definition doesn't take into account objects, doesn't take into account objects that have been created from space resources, in outer space. It only accounts for objects launched, objects landed on the moon, and constructed on the moon and other celestial bodies. So that is that, and this is, of course, a great problem for people who like I, think that many things that actually the Mars cities and Mars future states would require is to have a ability to create their own objects, habitats, repair parts, spare parts, and so on and so forth, to be less dependent on what the people of the Earth would send them or not. Because that's a point of policy. If somebody has something you require, like for example oil, they can dictate your price and affect your political or your policy, especially domestic policy or foreign policy. So, okay, the non-appropriation. Non-appropriation is one of the most misunderstood aspects of international space law, because it is basics of the international space law. The Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty states that states cannot, the member states of the UN cannot appropriate celestial bodies. Well, they cannot make moves for national appropriation of state of celestial bodies. And furthermore, they cannot claim sovereignty via occupation, which is sending Martians, for the Mars astronauts, to Mars, and having a permanent base there. It doesn't give you the rights of for sovereignty over Mars or its part, only the jurisdiction over the space object. And second of all, by no other means. So, by no other means actually homesteading. Well, what is homesteading? It's the American principle, which has a mechanism where you would register a land right for a plot of land, which was unused by anyone. It was during the times of the extension of the frontier where they actually started building farmland homesteads, and if you would live off the land and work on the land, you would gain the property rights. And that is what by other means mean. You cannot gain sovereignty or appropriate land via, for example, mining activities on the surface of a celestial body. Jurisdiction and control. Excuse me for a second. Yeah. Jurisdiction and control. Jurisdiction and control, as I said, comes with registration. For example, American modules fall under the jurisdiction of the United States. Russian modules fall under the jurisdiction and control of Russia. European models fall under the jurisdiction of, well, it depends. Because there is the question in ESA, who actually registers what part of the model or the main part of the model, and who controls it, and mostly is that states actually give ESA the right to control this space object. And the problem of jurisdiction in ESA is well, in my specialty, I call it a matryoshka jurisdiction. A matryoshka jurisdiction coming from the Russian nesting dolls, which is a jurisdiction within a jurisdiction covered by a jurisdiction. It's kind of similar to the US space shuttle. The space shuttle mostly was a American, talking about the orbiter, fell under the American jurisdiction, but it could have space objects which could actually operate in an industrial or scientific mode of operation. For example, manufacturing or testing some materials in microgravity. which were outside of the American jurisdiction, even though they were operated by American astronauts. And it was even covered by the United States in 1990's Patents in Space Act. But anyway, that's what jurisdiction gives you. It gives you the extension of the law, and that a government can, if they of course have the right to do so, they can actually seize your space object, and furthermore, or that is why you actually need to file for a how do you call? I forgot the name. They need for authorization or a license, as the U.S. was supposed to legislate about the Free Space American Enterprise Act of 2017 and 2019 didn't pass the recent Congress, so they still don't have special authorities and legislative and administrative bodies that would supervise space mining or supervise space manufacturing. Well, or operations on the surface of celestial bodies. But anyway, you have to go through the authorization process, because that is how you actually gain the legal recognition. Because if you are authorized, your nation actually takes political responsibility for everything you are doing in outer space. Next thing is harmful contamination. And this is mostly understood as not bringing human bacteria to places where they can dwell in outer space, especially if there is a possibility of life there, for example, water. There are also ideas of different biochemistries, but we are not going to talk about astrobiology here. That is my girlfriend's job. She's doing a PhD in astrobiology. So anyway, harmful contamination also includes nuclear waste, radiation, and other things that are very adverse to living beings, or creating space debris or space junk, which is also a problem in outer space, which hasn't been yet addressed by space law. There are only recommendations which then go into national space law. Because, well, one thing I have to say here. This is what I just said is an international space law. National space regulations, for example, in France or in the United States, actually have considered the idea of space debris. Whereas there are no such provisions in the international space law besides the liability for damage caused by a space object or its fragment. And as we all know, space debris is mostly fragments of space objects or their components. And so that is also the liability for anything that happens. But we have to recall one thing. The liability for something that happens also consists of the idea that you're making a propulsive landing on the moon near somebody else's space object, and you're spewing, well, you're actually spewing the dust, the regolith and the rocks from beneath your exhaust, and they are being launched at very high velocities. On a celestial body with low natural gravity and nearly no atmosphere, so there is actually no atmospheric drag to stop them. So they have high speeds, and they can easily damage a very light scientific equipment. So that is also to be understood with the liability. Also, you have liability for robots, and probably there will be also talks about liability for human actions on celestial bodies. So, we're now going to discuss in the terms of space law, utilizing one's surroundings. So, the ISRU, the in situ space resource utilization, and homesteading. Because, as I said, homesteading is illegal, but not in a sense that you can do it. You cannot just simply claim that because you have worked the land, that is the land that, for example, belongs to the United States, Russia, China, or India, any other spacefaring nation, even Australia. So anyway, for as far as we know, and for as far as international space law goes, you actually can utilize your surroundings in order to develop new space stations or special equipment to create shieldings and so on and so forth. But there is also the issue that we don't know if your jurisdiction actually covers the shielding itself or just the artificial equipment that you have brought here. The American Space Enterprise Act, as I might call it, the one that didn't pass the Congress, actually include the idea of creating artificial objects from space resources and treating them as space objects. So for me, for example, that was a great thing because it clears a lot of problems and creates new ones. Because I don't know how many of you know this, but in the international space law community, there is a saying that colonizing space creates more problems than it solves. Because you have to actually recreate everything you have on Earth in order to secure, for example, human rights and human agency, so on and so forth, security. So, to reiterate, you can do many things on the surface of Mars, as long as they are, first of all, peaceful. Second of all, they are not considered harmful contamination. And third of all, you don't make a claim of sovereignty. For example, you cannot put a chicken wire around your base and sell plots on Mars, just saying, well, my base is covered by the chicken wire, so everything inside the chicken wire is my base. Well, that doesn't work that way, but I think there would be many people who would actually argue this business case, and having a good lawyer, they could even win such case in the court. So, also, the utilizing of surroundings. For me, in my research, I actually also include the idea of using synthetic organisms, but I mostly work in space manufacturing law, and we are less considered on does space law allow it, but rather is it patentable? Is it a patentable subject matter, and what happens if they reproduce or go onto another nation's base? Wait. And also we have something different. I told you about international space law. I spoke about the themes of national space law. There is also intergovernmental space law, which is mostly based on the fact that it regulates only some matter, only some complex space operation or space object. For example, we have the ISS and the Artemis Accord. So the Artemis Accord is a kid on the block here. So first we start with the ISS. The ISS is governed by the Intergovernmental Agreement called the IGA, the IGA. So the IGA actually regulates many things, like for example, commercializing modules, jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction, civil jurisdiction, patent jurisdiction, and so on and so forth, and utilizing free trade, exchange of data, and so on, things that weren't actually covered in the international space law. So that is one of my ideas for the future of Mars missions, and this is what actually comes with Artemis. Artemis doesn't have the same regulations as ISS. The Artemis Accords are very general in this sense. They include the idea of space resources, they include the idea of standardization, which for me, as somebody who works on the space manufacturing law, is very interesting because it allows you to actually cannibalize parts of space debris or wrecks in a way that you could actually reuse those parts in other objects, which is a very interesting thing because, you don't have to deal with space debris anymore. You can actually either melt it down or you can repurpose it for any other solutions. And also, it has the idea of safety zones, as I said about propulsive landing. That was the basic idea that was being discussed by the Hague work group during their sessions in Hague and Luxembourg. So anyhow, the Artemis and the ISS are the new idea of how space law should work, where countries actually come together and create their own projects and regulate it as they need to. This is, of course, very disturbing for many scholars in this field of international space law, as these agreements are mostly inter partes, between the parties. Like, for example, the Outer Space Treaty is a general treaty of the United Nations. However, the Artemis Accords or the ISS do not include, for example, China or India or any other non-partner states. So they are not covered. They don't take part in these activities. Well, that is the drawback of these kind of activities, but it also comes from a place of a geopolitical, a geopolitical conflict, or actually mostly a political cabinet conflict. But I won't delve into this too much because, we are talking about Mars here. So anyhow, we have to recall that these agreements actually will be something that I see as the future of any Mars settlement, for example, in the beginning. Because after this, we'll have to discuss governance and self-governance of a Martian settlement. Depending on the state of the international or national law, for example. Because if a national law might create an act that would give a certain autonomy to a larger space settlement, not a mere base for example, a dozen of astronauts, but a actual dwelling city and a city, not a robot village, just to reiterate, they can actually this can actually be something, not colonization per se, but something very close to it. However, there might be also the idea that the Mars settlement will be governed from outside. Not from the inside, for example, not self-governing Martian settlements, but actually being governed by people from Earth, and having a provisional or a proxy on site, just so he could keep order on the on the station. Just anyhow. There are many difficulties with these ideas. For example, the UN would actually be very angry that any nation would create their own large space settlement with thousands of people. But on the other hand, if you have the power to do so, international politics says clearly, if you have the power, you can, and nobody is going to stop you. So this is something that, well, I know that Elon Musk would had a very large grin if he would hear that. But anyway, well, going back to the self-governance. Well, my point is that there should be actually a a system of self-governance placed on Mars and giving some authoritative power to the people inside the dwellings, because, well, it's something like regulating a difficult environment without actually being there. It's something like for example, an administrator in an ivory tower saying to people, well, just don't be poor. So this is the same thing we have here. If you don't have a local authority, you are very, very dependent on not only on self-reliance, but also on the whims and wills of those who remain on Earth. Also, we have to talk about how when there is going to be a governance, for example, internal governance that is going to be created by the people of Mars upon some basic rules that are going to be set up for them, but afterwards they are going to change the rules in order to better fit their lifestyle, because, well, it's difficult to create a city from the bottom, well, from the top up. It's better to create a society from the bottom up, but both have their drawback. Anyhow, first of all, there's going to be the administration that has to consider the internal policy and well-being of the society. Because if you have a administration that isn't interested in the well-being of the society, but only in the industrial operations of a Martian city and other such compounds, you're talking about slavery and exploitation. You need to have utilities like power, water, oxygen, breathable air, and so on farming to maintenance, that should support the society and aid the administration and be sustainable and safe. In order to aid the administration, I also include the idea of the use of deep learning, artificial intelligence, and also some supervision, which is going to be addressed in a different part here. And also the society. If you don't have a society, the city is dead, basically. You have the city runs on people. We have to remember that. So you're creating a city for people and not creating people to fit the city. Without addressing the needs of the people, the city is a death trap. That is something we've discussed with Simon when he was talking about his ideas and problems with the most popular Martian architectures. We also need to recall that many times we've read, probably many of you have read in Foreign Policy, Business Insider, and other very intelligent publications about the democratic, anarchic, or authoritarian forms of government on Mars. Well, it mostly depends on the time period, the culture, the trends of people who are establishing this settlement. We have to recall that. First of all, the smaller settlements are mostly going to be somewhat authoritarian and very disciplined, because, there is a very strict command chain. And on the other hand, if you have more and more people, you cannot maintain this command chain, unless you're a military. You will still have authority, but those people are not in a state of war and they should be governed very differently. although there are some problems with that also. Anyhow, we need to recall that we still have governments that are very totalitarian and cultures which do not, for example, employ the same idea of human rights, that don't share the same values and cultural trends, and this will affect the type of the government, people who are in the government, and how the government is being ruled, and what the internal law says. For example, I'm going to talk about crime and punishment later, but to just give you a bit of what I'm trying to say. If, for example, a society mostly believes in something like the capital punishment and throwing somebody out of the airlock, you could actually end up with a society with a law which actually states that for some kind of crime you can be thrown out of the airlock. That's not very humane, but as I said, we need to recall who is actually being the people. We can place on them some laws that are actually being that are actually requiring them to never create such kind of regulations, or we can dictate them from Earth and state, well, you cannot do this or that, but they are on Mars. And what are we going to do about this? Send the police? Well, that's a very long time, and they can be either dead or they can secede from Earth, if we would ever call it that way, this way. Well, the authoritarianism, as I said, is very favored in the case of a starting base, but not favorable for later periods, because, well, there might be rebellions, there might be problems of, overreaching of power. For example, somebody who is very authoritarian, the authoritarian governments tend to be, self-centered, and sometimes the personality can be narcissistic, or can actually fall into internal feuds and problems that we saw in, for example, the Roman Empire or the Ptolemaic dynasty. From which Cleopatra originates, and she knew what is fratricide. Anyhow, also democracy has its own problem, but it gives the inhabitants the sense of agency and representation, which is a very needful thing, for example, for people who live outside of the global society, as you may call it. They are actually enclosed, as I said, in those cities. Well, of course, there is the problem of the open society, where you have societies governed by a direct democracy, utilizing the liberal attitudes towards speech, policy, and relations, and they have no end goal, which means that they are prone to fall or prey to populism, because, if you don't have a idea that is, for example, being the dominant, and you exclude some fringe ideas, it is very easy to fall prey to some form of populism, for example. Or if you, for example, say that, if you, for example, tell people that they don't have to actually work on Mars, they can live and get universal basic income, and let robots do their job and see how it works out. Or, for example, that they don't have to repay something to Earth, or work in some mines and anything like that, or that you actually have to throw out some portion of the populations because they do this or that. This is very disturbing thought, but we have to remember these still are humans, and that's not to say that that is what humans do. That is what can society do to humans. And also, who controls the price? I was going to write who controls the spice, but, well, let's say who controls the price, who controls the politics. The price of necessities and commodities will be a driving factor in decision making. Well, the price of the air, the air, water, and other necessities, and also commodities. They will be a problem because if people don't have a very good access to them, and it is a very regulated access to air, to water, for example, to energy, heat, or even going outside, even in a suit. They would be very dependent on the people who control it, but that's the one problem the Martian society needs to face, is how to create a slight abundance of those necessities, so that they don't fall prey to some, well, let's say not even a psychopath or a sociopath, but somebody who has an inclination to be the one in power. So that you cannot, for example, force people to democratically choose the people you like, because if they don't choose who you like, you won't give them air, or you won't give them enough water. You can, if you can do that, well, we know this from geopolitics and from energy policy, that some things like that, especially with scarcity, tend to happen. So we actually need to always keep a lookout on how it is managed, how it is controlled, and how do people actually get access to these necessities. Privacy. Privacy is a very delicate issue, and the problem with it, as I see, is that on one hand you have you utilize sensors, you utilize AI for Martian cities for the for the monitoring of usage of necessity. How many oxygen, how many water, what checking the hormone levels, for example, if you see if somebody is pregnant or develops a form of cancer, or you have plagues, or even other adverse environmental impacts, for example, bad radiation shielding, or something, some problem with water, or regolith coming into contact with living organisms, for example, bad decontamination, the water treatment. These things need to be monitored because, well, that's a very closed environment. But also, this means that people will be living in a kind of panopticon, where they actually will be monitored at their every step. So this actually means that some people may be over paranoid about it, but I see it as, on one hand, you're trying to get them security, but on the other hand, we all know that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and information is power, whether we like it or not. So the society will need to actually create a form of transparency where the little brother, as Cory Doctorow used to put it, will oversee the actions of the big brother in a form of surveillance, as far as I recall, or it was called the rule of law. Excuse me. And the rule of law, of course, is the problem that we are facing in many even developed countries today. And also there is the question of will there be sheriffs on Mars, on the Moon? Yeah. So anyway, as I wrote here, space law will be international space law will be the first law to fall prey to changes in order to ensure the existence of a Martian settlement. it will have to be changed or adapted in a way that will not require a large administration or being having ambiguous regulations that would treat, for example, Martian settlers as a space station, but actually as a actual functioning community. Anyhow, there is also the idea that Mars might no longer be, but only might no longer be, treated as a celestial body in the context of space law, where and also the idea of governance and equals the object equals jurisdiction will also be changed into another form of control and jurisdiction. Well, anyhow, it works this way. If Mars is no longer a celestial body, you would get the idea of land governance, land rights, and so on and so forth, but it might not be even managed by the terrestrial government, but the local governments. But this is actually an idea that the actual on-site authority would have to work on, and not the terrestrial governments, because there are too many people dependent on the on the ability of the settlement to grow, to reproduce itself, for thus creating other habitats, and repair itself. So there would actually be something like a space living organism, as Rachel Armstrong puts it. They would have to actually be self-sufficient in order to do that. And also the administrative body needs to enforce laws and regulations, so there would actually be the Earth 2.0 government placed on Mars, and this is a large but. As I said, they would actually be composed of people who, although they bring to Mars their terrestrial baggage of problems, of, for example, privileges, traumas, and so on, they would actually start out fresh. Most of them would start out fresh. But they will also create some new type of society dependent on the environment they are living in. So anyway, there are going to be changes, and also the law enforcement is a problem here, because as Charlie Strauss states it, first of all, well, of course, Charlie Strauss was mostly referring to space stations and spaceships, but the idea that, for example, the present-day space operations are being done on the backs of thousands of people, well, there isn't going to be much liberty and much libertarianism in outer space, and in our case on Mars. But also, well, the problem here is that if you, for example, deny if you, for example, deny your obligations to work your shifts on maintenance, that is a problem, because, well, on Earth you can be unemployed. On Earth you can deny, you can actually dodge the draft, for example, or deny military service, police service, and so on. On Mars, this is going to be a more difficult case, for especially in the younger societies, where everybody has to work and everybody has to be on alert for any signs of problems with air, with leakage, with maintenance, and so on and so forth. So you saying no might be life or death for others. and unfortunately, well, that's the problem of living in a closed habitat. Well, partially closed, because we have to recall that these habitats will always interact with the environment, either radiate heat or take in solar radiation, and also they will of course use the local the local resources as far as they can go. So anyway, there is going to be a democracy, but there is also going to be some discipline in place. And well, the crime and punishment. We all know that Elon said that he's going to make his own laws on Mars. Whether or not he succeeds, that's a different point. He is right about one thing. Martians will make their own laws about, for example, contaminating water or contaminating the crops or any other or pollution and so on. Thus, if you vandalize some piece of equipment, you might be more severely punished than you would be on Earth, for example, in the United States. So he is right about that there will be a different set of laws on Mars because it's a different environment, but there isn't much work in the space law academia on how Martian courts or any other space courts that would be dealing with larger settlements could be structured. And well, the question of prisons on Mars. Do we actually do prisons, or do we go some Clockwork Orange idea of reprogramming a human being? Or do we go through for example, the Swedish way, something I call the therapying the violence out of someone? Anyway, the issue also of policing and having a defense lawyer. So having, for example, 1,000 people, you'd actually have to have some of them doing security duties and acting as a police force. For example, even a voluntary police force in shifts, like, for example, the IDF in Israel, there is a compulsory military service. So, but let's say that it won't be the case, and let's try to make it a normal security force that is composed of Martians and not of want to replicate all the human rights that are given to people on Earth. So if human rights here, he or she or they should have human rights beyond. Well, that's also a problem for many reasons, but let's just say that if you want to do a Mars city with Mars laws, you would have to have either a defense lawyer or a different type of court. Also, the question of civil law, because criminal law is very interesting because people do crimes, and we know that the crime novels and crime stories sell better. But what about civil law? Well, the civil law mostly consists about trade, rent, and so on, payment, barter, and so on. And the question is, how would it work? Would it be statutory law or common law? Well, these are different systems that function, for example, in Europe and the Anglo-Saxon world. But well, the law needs to be created, and it will probably go in the way similar to, let's say, British courts, that it would have some statutory laws, but in many cases it is going to be a common law procedure where they are actually making the law on fly. And also the courts need to resolve transplanetary disputes. For example, what about people who are getting a divorce and living on two planets? Or, for example, the logistical companies, like, for example, transport, mining, and so on, and it falls under the Martian jurisdiction. So the courts is also a topic that will need to be addressed if we don't want to fall under the, for example, terrestrial courts. And let us be reminded that people who would be ruling in the terrestrial courts might have never seen Mars on their own eyes or never lived in such a city, thus making it very difficult for them to actually understand the situation and what has been going on and what the difficulties are being faced by the Martians. I was asked also to address the idea of piracy. There is a concept of space piracy, although not in space law, but in space law academia. And it has been very nicely presented in James Cambias's sci-fi thriller novel, The Corsair, where the space pirate is not a swashbuckling, eye patch, peg leg, and paro kind of guy in a spacesuit, but a hacker who hacks space objects from Earth, and he mostly hacks he was mostly hacking in helium-free transports for other people. Well, he redirected them to drop into the ocean, and some people would pick them up and run away with them from a given site. And that was how the piracy worked. And this is how most of it will work in outer space, because it was mostly consists of taking control over a space object, spacecraft, or even a habitat system, and using it for wrongdoing, for example, theft, or even murder, carjacking, well, not carjacking, spacecraft jacking, any kind of crime you can do with a space object that is being taken without its owner's permission. That is actually what you would call piracy in outer space. So yes, there will be a need to first of all prosecute this kind of act. Second of all, how to actually manage and keep the infrastructure safe from it, that's a different kind of beast of itself. I was also asked about the issue of the military. Yeah, will the Martians have their own military? My answer from the point of view of international space law is no. Well, okay, maybe yes, but actually no, as in the old movie he was said. The contemporary space law does not prohibit military personnel, even soldiers, on celestial body, but it prohibits bases and fortifications and maneuvers and testing of weapons. So if you don't have fortifications, you're actually not having a good use for the military. Especially if you're a smaller dwelling and you could be invaded by a larger neighbor from the inner part of the inner solar system. Anyhow, the personnel may be stationed there for the peaceful purposes only. So that is also the idea from international space. From national point of view, well, you have the Space Force, which is mostly a teleinformatic form of protection of space assets of the United States. Similar forces actually exist in the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, Republic of France. So that is nothing that is that's not anything out of the ordinary. Although the name Space Force recalls an old cartoon which is called Starcom, the United States Space Force. It was something like G.I. Joe, but in space. But anyhow, the idea is that, there needs to be more of a security than military, but if one wants to have a military, and it is going to be a different sort of regulations. For example, either the international an international endeavor that would include, for example, the blue helmets, as far as I recall, they were called the UN peacekeeping force, or any other form of foreignly supervised military. Well, that will be that. But for example, if it's a self-governing space city, well, they might actually establish their own military, but there is also the question of, is there a point in that? For example, you have to keep in mind that there is no such thing as an unarmed spaceship. Your propulsion drive, whether it's a nuclear-powered, chemical-powered, or even a light sail, that's a solar cell derivatives that is powered by a laser, that is also a weapon. And you need to keep that in mind. And if you have mass drivers and other types of launch catapults, well, they are also weapons. Not mentioning that most satellites are dual-use technologies that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. And the last thing that I want to address, that please do not nuke the poles. The contemporary space law actually forbids the use of nuclear weapons and any nuclear explosions in atmosphere, outer space, and so on and so forth. And also there was a treaty on the direct use of civilian nuclear devices in outer space in the 70s. Although I still see people running around and let's nuke the poles, like like Elon Musk said. Well, no, that's currently prohibited. But as I stated many times during this talk, things can change, and they do change, either for the better or for the worse. There are many situations which are actually generation defining and even law defining. For example, the 9/11 attacks, which actually changed many domestic and international laws. Because the situation was very difficult, people were very afraid of their safety, so they chose security and the possibility of government overreach, and giving superpowers, let's say, to agencies like the Homeland Security and the NSA. So anyhow, that would be all for today. So thank you for listening, and it's time for Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation, Camille. Very interesting. We have some questions, but before we get to that, I would like to tell our viewers that people can, even during this Q&A, keep asking questions that we will try to ask you. And also people can join our Nexus Aurora Global Aerospace Innovation Network by joining our Discord server, to which you can find a link below the video on YouTube, and of course on our subreddit for Nexus Aurora as well. Camille, you talked about that at the very beginning, actually, about some large-scale space agreements that seem to have stopped after the 70s a little bit, right? So 79 was maybe the last large one, with which a lot of countries actually agreed upon. As a joke, you could say that all of these people who are trying to buy pieces of land off the moon and all of those kinds of strange online things, those people will be out of luck, because those treaties prohibit all of that, and you actually do not own a piece of the moon if you pay some money for some kind of certificate. So what is interesting to this whole talk is that when we at our Nexus Aurora network are thinking about space exploration, is that space law is actually never really talked about, or at least too little. And if you think about it, it could actually be very limiting, if I understand your talk correctly, to what you can do in outer space according to all of these laws. And you actually said, that was a pretty crazy quote maybe, but that space law advocates say, colonizing space creates more problems than it solves. So you said that, and
Yes.
that might feel for some people as very sort of limiting for their space exploration ideas. They feel that way maybe. But
that's why what I meant by it is that you have to actually recreate all the laws that you have on Earth and create new ones. For example, for trade, for entering Martian terraformed atmosphere. For example, after terraforming, you have to Martian air law, Martian sea law, and so on and so forth. If you actually have some oceans and other bodies of water, but anyway, you would have the Environmental Protection Acts. You would have other types of problem, the sanitation, the access to the internet, the problem of connection, the problem of satellites. There are many things that will actually be addressed here. For example, if you find living beings, for example, bacteria, that's also the problem of whether you make Mars a natural reserve, or you can actually create patches of land which can be settled, mined and industrialized, and other patches that, they are off limits to, for example, people who aren't assigned scientists.
But can I just say that because this is of course thought about from maybe even an Earth perspective about what laws actually mean, and also that you, as you talked about, you would like to ideally be able to enforce these kinds of laws. But you touched about on this subject. But before we get to the Q&A, I have one question myself, and that's like, okay, so a starship lands on Mars, and you talked about chicken wire fence that you can't really put that up according to international laws, and you can't sell plots of land.
You can put it up, but you cannot declare that this plot of land is your land.
Okay, so now the thing is, Elon Musk is going to do it anyway. Now what? And that you talked a little bit about that, but I think like the burning question in all of this is like, okay, we have all of these laws, we even have international agreements, and we have all of these countries maybe even saying exactly what you say. We need to have laws and regulations. We even signed them. All of these countries agree on them, and then SpaceX sends a starship there and actually starts selling land to people all over the world. And they actually do have only one way to get there, and that is with the starship of SpaceX. So who is going to enforce the laws in this example? How would you say this would work if someone is not going to he's not going to be taken accountable for all of these space laws. He's going to do whatever he or she wants. What then?
Well, first of all, there are administrative measures in the United States because, SpaceX is based in the United States. But, I don't want to... Okay, let's just show it this way. If Elon Musk liquidates every asset he has in the US and moves with, for example, 10 starships of people, equipment, and so on to Mars, if the United States don't have a similar measure to bring him back, there is no way they can enforce their law. And that is something that was even written in the 1930s by Vladimir Mandl in his work Das Weltraumrecht. The problem, which was actually one of the first works on international space law, which was based then on aviation law. And in the last parts of Das Weltraumrecht, Mandel stated that the farther you are from Earth, the harder for the long arm of justice is to get you. So anyhow, yes, there is a problem of enforcement. If you are, for example, a satellite company, it's very easy to enforce it because you're based on Earth. And there is always the FBI or any other law enforcement agency that can come in, cuff you, secure all your computer, and so on. But if you're outside, well, that's a difficult thing for them to do because they don't even have the infrastructure to launch them. We don't even have, let's say, Space Force drop troops, as some people speculate about.
So what could be done is to enforce some measures on Earth itself towards a company, person, or even a country. If a country, let's say China, does this, and then you could enforce some things that actually happen on Earth. But as you also state, even in the 1930s, it was clear that the further you go away from Earth, it's actually going to be a lot harder to enforce. Okay,
well,
so
let's just say, what else can they do? They can actually hack their computer assistants and what? Kill them? Asphyxiate them? And this is actually an atrocity. Not even speaking about the UN, but even their own domestic, their own people, their own national populations will be angry. They will be outraged because, well, they had families, they had neighbors who went there, and those people were just snapped, like in the Expanse, thrown out into the vacuum. So because, well, Elon Musk did a crime, or any other things like that. Well, sorry, but or even launching a kinetic kill missile or anything like that. That's an act of war and an atrocity on people. Even though those people actually ran away from Earth and so on, if we treat them as they don't have any human rights, well, that's saying something about us, not about them.
Yeah. I think most people would agree with you on that. But then still the question remains, what if people don't care about that? But that's, of course, very difficult to answer. We also need to see a lot about these things in practice, because what happens if actually these kinds of questions need to be answered in reality, because we are actually landing people on Mars, for example, or taking long journeys through space. So that's very interesting to talk about. I'm going to go to some of the questions that people have asked on different social media, like Reddit, but also with the video and on our Discord server, which again, all of you guys can join with the link below the video. So CPL Ginger asks how you feel about the Artemis Accord and their attempt to bend the international community towards complying with working alongside the United States. Can you tell us something about that?
I find the Artemis Accords quite general as a act of intergovernmental law, because it doesn't regulate many things. It only declares it has a set of declarations on, for example, all the jurisdiction, the safety zones, the space resource exploitation. Also, as far as I recall, it was the kind of issue of space debris, wrecks, salvage, and so on, and scientific data, the cooperation with nations. I'm quite positive about it, but also I would like to see it as a more a broader agreement because, well, I know that the United States doesn't want to go and cooperate with China. That's a problem of industrial policy, national security, and so on. They are rivals, so we have to understand their movements because, well, what drives space law is also national security and national policy. That's the basic geopolitics, but there needs to be a similar law that would be actually respected by everyone, by India, China, and so on, because India is also excluded from the Artemis Accords. Well, excluded. It's not part of them, but I don't think that the US will approach India. ESA would approach India, but not the United States. They have different ideas on things like that. But, well, we need to recall that if we don't get some kind of consensus in this context, both India and China have in their possession anti-satellite weapons. So if you have anti-satellite weapons, you can actually threaten to shoot down any any transport of ore, isotopes, or anything like that from outer space. Of course, that's an atrocity. Of course, that may be a declaration of war, but you can also do it by proxy, like proxy wars are going, and they also can sell it to nations who say, we want a share of those resources. Either you give us a cut in those resources, or we will shoot your transport down. And that is
if we get back to the Artemis Accord specifically, because otherwise it's difficult maybe also for the listeners to keep understanding. I think maybe connecting to at least the answer that you gave, Henry Manelski, who's also from Poland, who lives in New York, New Jersey right now, but. He asks, and he's also on the Discord server, he asks, when will we rewrite the Outer Space Treaty, I should say? Since we talked and you explained that in the 70s, many of those treaties were the last large-scale multi-country treaties. Can you talked a lot about this. You talk a lot about things that all countries should agree upon in order for all of this to work. Do you see a path towards that since it hasn't happened for the past 40 years?
That's very difficult because the countries need to come to terms on many issues. And if the issue is space resources and space resource policy, that is going to be a showstopper and a deal breaker for many nations because, some nations that have been affected by, for example, the years of colonialism or problems of domestic wars and even the setback in development would like to see an international support from the nations that are actually involved in mining. In my paper, which was published in Deep Space Commodities, by Tom James. It was Palgrave Macmillan 2018 or 2018. I've presented a concept of creating a fund, or an international entity that would actually create ventures for miners. But the idea was that every nation has a share in this venture, but miners don't get profit from mining. They only get paid for their work. Or, for example, for creating an investment on technology, and afterwards only get paid for an asteroid, for a part of the moon, and so on and so forth. But they don't get paid for the resource. The resource gets to the venture, and the venture then divides the funds to this nation, that nation, and so on and so on. So it would actually be, a better idea than to force a nation or its private entities to share the resources, but actually giving them employment in such a venture.
So you could say that maybe space mining is a chance also for many countries to work together. So when we in that way, maybe even companies even who will start doing that instead of countries will actually need to be talking to each other, and especially when competition arises. So that might actually be a chance to breathe new life into this kind of idea of international space treaties, right?
There's also the problem that, if you want to rewrite a outer space treaty, we would also have to declare what is a celestial body, what is not a celestial body. And if we want to also regulate the resource activity, we have to address what a resource is. Let's say let's just give it a, let's just say it this way. We all heard about helium-3. It has been discovered in the Apollo 17 samples that were brought back by Harrison Schmitt. 13 years after he got back from the moon. So after that, there was a great, scream of joy. Wow, we have helium-3 on the moon. We don't have to go to Jupiter. Because most of those people didn't know that helium-3 is a product of solar fusion and is actually a part of the solar wind, which is then being placed by it in the lunar regolith, because, the moon doesn't have such a strong magnetosphere in order to block it. The Jovian helium actually comes from its natural deposits. Also, comets might have helium-3 if they have helium in them because it's a natural isotope. But anyway, why am I talking about astrophysics and astrochemistry right now? You see, mining helium on the moon, it is going to be regulated because it's a mining activity on a celestial body, yes? Of course. But what if you put a electromagnetic trap on a Lagrange point, the Earth-Sun Lagrange point, and you just siphon the hydrogen and the helium from the solar wind, from the magnetic plasma of the solar wind? This is not mining a celestial body. So it's not regulated in the same way. And that is my point. The problem is that the same resource, if you didn't get this, for example, you could even put the same magnetic trap between the sun in such a way that it will be between the sun and the moon, and the same helium-3 that lands on the moon is being treated differently than the one that is just coming out of the sun.
Yes, so what you're talking about is that if it is already hard to actually describe what a celestial body is, in this example, it's going to be hard to enforce any laws that might also arise when we create new technologies, and in this case, with your harvesting method at the Lagrange point, that's not really written in the 1970s agreements. So if I go to the next questions, otherwise we can't really.
One thing I have to also reiterate. One thing that, for example, what is a resource? It depends on who is doing the utilization. For example, if you're a rich terrestrial venture capitalist, you want rare earth elements, for example, promethium, thorium, and so on, tantalum, for example, electronics, PGMs from asteroids and also the moon, isotopes. Yeah, that is your bottom line, So you want those rich things that we're getting from some celestial bodies. But for someone who lives on Mars, on the moon, a resource is something completely different. A regolith is a resource. Regolith is a resource because you can create roads, you can create many equipment, you can use it to create some basic tools if you need it, You can use water, you can use hydrogen from the regolith, you can use oxygen from regolith, even for Martians. This is what I said about homesteading and utilizing. That is because, this is something completely different from somebody who needs to thrive on Mars. You don't need PGMs because you're not a microchip production factory or a fuel cell production factory. You want to survive. You can actually sell those resources to other parties. But
can I just, especially because there's one question that really fits well with this topic that's asked by Cosimo, and he asks, what would happen, for example, with the sale of minerals that you have mined, for example, on Mars, since you can't claim sovereignty about these celestial objects? Can you maybe highlight again, because you talked about it briefly, but can you explain what would happen then?
Well, the problem is that you cannot claim sovereignty if you were mining over the territory, but if you have already mined a celestial body and extracted some minerals, well, there are arguments against it, but mostly it is being understood that you can sell everything you have obtained from the outer space or a celestial body. So in this way, you could actually sell those metals. But on the flip side, there is a difficulty to maintain the security of a mine if you cannot create, for example, safety zones. For example, that's not the problem. The problem is where everybody has, I forgot to say that everybody has a right to access to space, a free and unobstructed access to space. So nobody can tell you, no, you cannot land near me. No, you cannot place an object near my object. This is my part of the moon. The problem is that the safety zones were actually created not only to exclude people because we want to mine the moon, but also to maintain safety. For me, the best example is space tourism. If you have normal tourists, how many tourist accidents are there annually? Where people actually go into a zoo and fall down or go through the fence and things like that, or go on a field trip and have an accident. So from my point of view, space tourism will be also a new source of space regulations because tourists can actually I don't want to say be stupid, but it can be actually negligent toward their own safety because they want to go and do some selfies and things like that. And they want to have a selfie with a mining harvester or any other plant, industrial plant like that. And, well, they can get in trouble. So in this, going back to the question, well, the problem will be that not everybody will recognize the right, but currently the US, has its basis for the right to actually sell the mined minerals, same as the United Arabian Emirates and also Luxembourg.
Okay, that's very interesting. Because of the time, I'm going to ask you two more questions before we close off the whole session. Thanks for all your time up till now. That's great.
Sorry it took so long.
No worries. It's very interesting to listen to you. There's actually more, maybe also a bit of a philosophical question from Mr. or Mrs. Zoe at the Slayer on the subreddit of ESA, actually. And he or she asks, why would you not question the premise of a law system itself in the first place? Can you maybe highlight why you feel the way you do actually about the space law?
Well, for me, it's mostly that, as we said in not said, but it was written in the intro to this session. It was that people that, although if you want to send robots somewhere, you have to give them programs. and most of them won't go out of their programs unless they have a malfunction or unless the program isn't clear or there was something with the sensors. But with humans, you need to have laws in order for them to know what they can and cannot do. So yes, I understand that people are asking, why do you have laws in the first place? But we need to also remind ourselves that not all people are very philosophical in their approach to other people. For example, women's safety. That was one of my concerns towards the Mars One venture. For example, okay, if they don't have a great selection and great training of their astronauts, or even if they do have, how do you maintain women's safety when you have people who are outside of terrestrial jurisdiction? How do you make them not kill someone or, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, sexually violate other people? There are people who we can easily call assholes. There are people who are murderers. There are people who are either mentally unstable or will become mentally unstable because of they are there forever. So what is so the same question is why do we need the economy for, the laws for? Because we are out in outer space on our own, let's say in our extraterrestrial commune, as the Timothy Leary would call the O'Neill cylinders. But at the same time, we need to recall that there are social dynamics, and there is personal psychology, and there is also neurochemistry, and there are things that can actually come out there. And if we send people there and they will create their own laws. Of course, there are many definitions of anarchy. There are definitions that say that is chaos and violence. Then there are definitions from anarcho-communism and Kropotkin. But would we vouch for that these people will maintain their own safety? Some people, yes. Some people might be concerned with that. But what is the odds that somebody would, for example, simply get depressed, don't get any medication or treatment because we have just rejected this part of the society or access to terrestrial knowledge, or we don't actually have this kind of compounds in order to treat his depression? What is, for example, to make, how do you call it, extended suicide? Where somebody kills
helping someone else, you mean?
No, I mean the suicide when the person committing suicide is killing himself and his family and so on.
Yeah, those are very important questions, which is why you say in this talk, of course, and also in answer to the question which was asked to you, that space law is actually very important to make sure that you can handle those kinds of situations. So thank you so much for that answer. So as a last question, Nexus Aurora, as you know, is about space colonization, which you would call space settlement or space settling instead of colonization, as you said at the beginning of your talk. But if you look at open source hardware on Mars, for example, would you have any advice on specifically using open source hardware or closed source or any other way to specifically use hardware on Mars? And how can you, for example, enforce copyright and all of those other kind of things that might happen in the future once we start settling other planets and moons?
Well, if you don't have a law enforcement that is specialized in enforcing patent law, the cease and you don't get cease and desist letters, or nobody can stop the production. For example, if you have, well, not even a self-replicating technology, or I don't know, 3D printers, 4D printers, and any other Santa Claus machine concepts. Well, there is the problem of maintaining patent protection on board of space ships, especially in deep space, such as Mars or the orbit of Jupiter, Neptune, and even the Oort cloud. Because there is no limit to space law. For example, the Moon Treaty actually limited the space law to the boundaries of the solar system. The outer space treaty doesn't do anything of this kind. It just celestial bodies, outer space, and doesn't put a limit on it. So, anyhow, well, patent jurisdictions mostly come with national jurisdictions besides the United States, because the United States has something like the extraterritorial jurisdiction. Let's say the jurisdiction can actually it's mostly called extraterritorial infringement, where you can actually infringe on somebody's patent if even if you are placed outside of the U.S. Or the U.S. controlled space object, vessels, or aircraft, but it actually has an effect on the U.S. On the U.S. soil, the U.S. citizens, and so on. This was the case with the not Raspberry, BlackBerry mobile phones. There was the case NPT versus Research in Motion, as far as I recall, 2006, and it was ruled that well, even though the radio mast was in Canada, and the system was also the company was based in Canada. Well, it had an effect on U.S. consumers who purchased BlackBerry. So they were it was claimed as an infringement. But I recall it was probably settled outside of court or something like that. Anyhow, well, there are many difficulties. For example, with doing counterfeit. Or counterfeit spare parts, which is what you actually need 3D printers for, or ISRU for. But also the issue of, for example, well, not mainly Mars, but for example, Earth orbit or deep space, when you could actually create, well, generic habitats or generic space stations or generic objects, and then sell it to other parties. And let's say that, for example, a country A, which is, for example, not the US, but another country, is building generic space objects like CubeSats and so on. But they are using American patent equipment. And all is well and good until somebody from the US buys it. And the problem is comes because it is under US jurisdiction. The patent holder can actually sue for infringement to the owner of the space object. And also there are problems with, for example, the refueling. For example, if you use a American pump on a space object, but you're based in a different country where that pump wasn't actually being protected by a patent, the sole usage of this pump for refueling may be also a cause for infringement because of the effect clause.
Could you maybe say about this then that if you want to protect your inventions, you could probably best make sure that a very powerful country or entity would enforce it if people would misuse it.
And also you have to create patent families in every jurisdiction that actually would use those or would be manufacturing or profiting from this. I remember Robert Zubrin had an idea that Martians could be selling patents and patented inventions to people back on Earth. This is a nice idea, although there are several problems with it, because they would actually be better selling a know-how or, well, inventions, yes, but not every invention created on Mars would be working the same way on Earth. Different air pressure, different and materials, for example. Martians would be more benefiting from simpler materials, which are more sustainable to obtain. But on the same part, they would actually be more benefiting from. They might be benefiting from patenting biotechnology, because, for example, biomining or using synthetic organism in order to manufacture or extract resources, or even, well, I don't use the word terraform here, but industrial form, from the prefix industrial, because it would be something like, if you have all those ideas for von Neumann probes and so on, they actually need to be something, either a super nanotechnological molecular assemblers and so on from Drexler, or bush robots from Hans Morawitz's concepts. But if you don't want to go a super technological way, you could actually create either microbots or tailored bacteria that would make the Martian ground into something of a soil, but it won't be for plants or plants per se, but other robots that would actually be able to get the minerals easier than through mining, blasting, and metallurgy. Because every time people say about mining on the moon and mining on Mars, many of them don't seem to never see how actual terrestrial mining works, and the problem of, for example, water as a mining fluid. If you have scarcity of water, you won't waste it on mining and metallurgy.
But
and
to
that's
get back,
where you have.
yeah, because also because of the time, we really need to make sure that
Okay.
that we keep to the question. But just in closing, one of the conclusions I at least draw from this interesting and in-depth talk from you, Camille, is that it is very important to not only create those laws, but to find a way to enforce them, which is equally as important, because it's quite hard to find agreements with all people around the world, as you said in your talk. Before we go, I would, of course, like to thank you for giving us this interesting insight, and I would really appreciate it if in our Nexus Aurora Discord, people could still ask you questions that they have, specifically about space law. You seem to be very knowledgeable about this topic, and I feel for sure that many of the different projects within the Nexus Aurora Global Aerospace Innovation Network can really learn a lot from you, and also how this would work maybe in real life, when some of our projects might in the future actually create hardware and software for space, which would be really an awesome outcome. So thanks. You already said that you were willing to provide us with some more knowledge on that front and answer some questions. So that's great. And with that, I would also like to say to all the people watching, if you are one of those people who really would like to ask Camille Musica these questions, join our Discord server of Nexus Aurora. Or any of the other projects that are part of the Global Aerospace Innovation Network. We have many different servers on very specific topics. And I would also like to say that Camille is also a member of the Polish Astrobiological Society and the Polish Science Fantasy Foundation.
Science Fiction Foundation.
Science Fiction Foundation. I wrote it down wrong here. Sorry about that. If you have any more questions, feel free to join our server and to come back and ask more questions. And with that, I would like to close this session, which has been almost 2 hours. So thank you so much for your generous time. My name is Koen. I've been your host from the Next Astro channel. And again, Camille Musica, I would like to thank you on behalf of the whole of the Nexus Aurora community and all the people watching for your generous time and long talk about this very interesting topic about space law. Thank you so much. Thanks you guys for watching, and see you soon, and maybe next week